Welcome everyone to today's kickoff of the EIRA initiative focused on rethinking innovation policy in the life sciences. My name is Heiden, and together with Jonathan Barnett, we are the co-directors of this initiative. EIRA is an applied research policy initiative being undertaken in association with the Berkeley Policy Institute, which was founded and led by the world's preeminent business scholar, Professor David Teese of the UC Berkeley Haas School of Business, as an independent nonprofit corporation to advance knowledge on policy and management through research, publication, and public engagement. Our mission at the initiative seeks to ground innovation policy in the biopharmaceutical, medical device, and life sciences industries in fact-based and economically informed analysis that moves beyond narrative, rhetoric, and anecdote. We embrace a wide range of quantitative and qualitative research methodologies, complemented where appropriate by legal analysis to generate empirical evidence as a trustworthy input to policymaking. The initiative supports applied research that focuses on understanding and developing market-driven and state-facilitated mechanisms to address the costs and risks borne by public, private, and nonprofit stakeholders across the full range of basic research, applied research, testing, production, and other steps involved in innovating and delivering new drugs, treatments, and devices for the healthcare ecosystem. We have a strong collaboration focus with an interest to work with a global community of contributors from academia, government, and industry, including economists, management scholars, legal academics, and practitioners, as well as technology transfer specialists and public health experts. We have a very strong commitment to independence, so the EIRA initiative is a nonprofit undertaking that upholds a commitment to independence and objectivity in producing data-driven research to inform the development of public policy in the life sciences community. The initiative maintains editorial independence and control over research methods, substance, and output. The commitment is acknowledged and recognized by the initiative supporters. All right, so now let's move on to the program by welcoming today's speakers. First of all, I'd like to welcome the Honorable Paul Michel, who's the former Chief Judge of the U.S. Courts of Appeal for the Federal Circuit. Welcome today, Paul.
Pleasure to be with you all.
Now I'd like to welcome David Kappos, who's a partner at Cravath, Swaine, and Moore, and the former Undersecretary of Commerce and Director of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. Welcome, David.
Yeah, thanks, Bo and Jonathan. Great to be here.
Next, I'd like to welcome Professor Kristina Acri, who's from Colorado College, Economics and Business. Welcome, Kristina.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
And now I'd like to welcome Professor Erika Lytzan, University of Missouri Columbia School of Law, and former partner at Covington and Burling. Did I get it right, Erika?
You did. It's Lytzan. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thanks. And now I'd like to welcome Professor Walter Copan, Vice President of Research and Technology Transfer, Colorado School of Mines, and former Undersecretary of Commerce and Director of the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. Welcome, Walt.
Thanks so much. Delighted to be part of the conversation today.
And last but not least, my partner and co-director, Professor Jonathan Barnett, University of Southern California at the Gould School of Law and Director of the USC Entertainment, Media, and Technology Law Program. Jonathan, good to see you, my friend. Over to you.
All right. Thanks a lot, Bo. What a great introduction. We're so excited to launch the initiative today, to release our report, and to have what I am confident is going to be an informative and engaging conversation with a group of panelists that are so distinguished. I'm both honored and humbled to be able to engage in a discussion about an area of innovation policy that I think sometimes gets somewhat less attention, at least in the scholarly community, than other innovation sectors, and that's the biopharmaceutical sector. But it's almost impossible to overestimate the importance of this sector. both in terms of the economic value that it contributes to the US and global economy, which is in the billions of dollars per year, in terms of the employment, including, I should add, manufacturing employment in the United States, that this industry contributes to the US economy. And beyond economics, perhaps most importantly, is the amazing improvements in human longevity and quality of life that are attributed to this industry. Everything that this industry contributes arises out of innovation. There is no industry sector in the United States that has a higher average level of R&D intensity. That's just a technical term for the amount of revenues that you plow back into R&D that this sector contributes. There's something else that is somewhat unique about this sector, which is that it's a wonderful example of how public funding interacts with private sector funding. That's a key theme of our initiative. A key theme of our initiative is to reintroduce balance into biopharmaceutical innovation policy analysis. Balance requires recognizing the importance of public funding for the basic research, the apex of the innovation pyramid, but also requires recognizing in a meaningful manner the vital importance of the private sector in converting public research into drugs and treatments that can actually help patients at the end of the day. And it's right there where our key conceptual focus, at least at this outset of our initiative, will be. And that's on the role of various types of intellectual property rights, which in the pharma sector extends beyond patents, in supporting incentives. And there's two types of incentives that are important to keep in mind. One form we're very familiar with, and that's the innovation incentive. And our very first panelist will be talking about exactly why that's so critical in innovation. But the other type of incentive is what I'll call investment, very broadly conceived. A very basic point, but sometimes somewhat overlooked, is that capital, private capital, can invest anywhere. And of course, it will chase after the highest profit that it can earn. What we want to do in the legal infrastructure that we supply to biopharma is we want to make that an attractive place for capital to invest. That's the catalyst. That's the catalyst that converts public research-funded basic research into private sector funded drugs and treatments. And as we'll be talking about throughout the process, this is a difficult process, it's a costly process, and we want to maintain a legal infrastructure that supports investment incentives. And I'll just end with the following point. There's two ways in which IP rights support investment incentives. The first, which is well known, is that it secures a profit in the event you're successful, which only occurs in a minority of cases. But the other, which is equally important, is that it enables transactions, cooperative transactions between different entities that are good at different things. Some firms, like biotech startups, are great at innovating, and other firms, like large pharmaceutical firms, are great at distributing, producing, and testing. One thing we'll be talking about in our session today is that another part of that catalytic function of IP rights is that it brings those parties together by enabling to negotiate and to share information in a way that makes business sense. So I'll end my remarks there. I encourage our viewers to take a look at our Engines of Innovation report, which explores these themes in greater detail. And I will now move on to our first panelist and speaker, Professor Walter Kopan, who will deliver some brief remarks, and then we'll be launching into a conversation. Go right ahead, Walt.
Thanks so much, Jonathan, and a great initiative indeed, and a wonderful report as a kickoff to this important consideration for research into this critical part of the global economy. Jonathan, you indicated this, the costs of drug development are certainly substantial and far exceed the types of investments that the public sector is prepared to invest in new drugs, with an average cost of around $1 billion to more than $4.5 billion to take a concept really coming from the laboratory and bringing it through all the phases of the clinic and then into manufacturing. The costs, of course, are highly dependent upon the therapeutic class of the drug. And increasingly, we are seeing the importance of applications of artificial intelligence and data science in the identification of potential new targets, new modalities. Ultimately, as we look at the risks associated with bringing new pharmaceuticals from starting point into ultimate approval by the FDA, on average, 10 to 12% of drugs that are successful enough in entering the clinical phases, only those 10 to 12% will ultimately be approved. And so as we look at the range of risks in the entire process, beginning with safety and toxicity, so everyone is certainly aware of the potential for side effects and how those need to be understood and mitigated if possible. All of the regulatory risks, including drug tolerance, and in some cases there are drugs. The opioid class is a perfect example where risks include tolerance and addictive potential. And so all of these effects are so important to understand the structure of the biopharmaceutical industry, the essentials of the public-private partnerships that underpin so much of the drug discovery and biomedical research, life sciences, and medical devices today. The National Institutes of Health in the United States is the largest funder of biomedical research globally, currently investing around $48 billion, and that trajectory has continued to increase over the past years, with the kind of general category of NIH research projects, the so-called R01 research, are the most common for the independent research that's carried out through the extramural funding provided by the National Institutes of Health. There's an important additional player in the ecosystem, and that is the role of science philanthropy. Increasingly, private foundations are substantially investing in new types of drugs, for example, for rare disease states, and supporting the early stage discovery phase, or the preclinical and translational phase, or indeed the later stage clinical research and trials leading to potential approval. And we've all seen the importance of long-term public sector investment with a classic case of messenger RNA and the vaccines and other therapeutics that have come from mRNA research, which were really discovered in the early 1960s. And so 5 decades of research ultimately then led to the breakthroughs in COVID-19 vaccines and indeed other therapeutic pathways. But the private sector, despite their massive investments in research, development, and deployment, simply do not have the capacity for that long-term discovery oriented research that federal funding or indeed science philanthropy is increasingly interested in supporting. These incentives, Jonathan, that you're talking about, recognizing the risks and the low probability of success in these discoveries to ultimately make their pathway into commercial and clinical use. Intellectual property protections are absolutely essential for the compositions of matter and formulations of delivery strategies, because those protections ultimately then provide the ability for an entity that's taking that risk to achieve a return on investment. In the case of an academic institution, a research institute, or teaching hospital, under the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980, which is absolutely foundational to public-private partnership in the United States, and is a legislation that has been broadly copied and utilized in other parts of the world also. These incentives then provide the ability of the institution to reinvest in its research enterprise, and also to provide some basis of recognition and reward for the inventor, with a system of rules of law that respect those intellectual property rights and enable, through licensing and manufacturing and distribution agreements, the appropriate protections of the fundamental discovery and its follow-on. So it's an exciting industry, certainly central. And as we look at the years before the Bayh-Dole Act, the United States was certainly not in any kind of a leadership position with respect to biopharmaceuticals. And certainly the field was dominated by the European players at that time. And we've seen now the importance of this system of public-private partnership and the incentives of the system that truly enable these innovations to reach the commercial marketplace and patients' bedsides. Thanks very much.
Walter, thanks so much. You got us off to a great start, and I think you gave us a great overview of how that public-private partnership works together to complete the whole innovation plus commercialization pipeline. And before I start our conversation with Walter, I just wanted to mention to our online viewing audience, we welcome your questions. Feel free to use the function in the that allows you to upload questions, and we will endeavor to integrate those into our discussion. What I'd like to do in the remaining time on this segment, Walter, is just to zero in a little bit on one element of the big picture. So I think you mentioned how the Bayh-Dole Act, which enables, for those who aren't aware, it enables federally funded research institutions to patent innovations that arise out of that research, which then snowballs into various ways in which that can be commercialized. And as you mentioned, that policy prescription has worked wonders. And not only in terms of innovation, but also in terms of entrepreneurship. So as the biopharma industry has responded favorably to this legal innovation of the Bayh-Dole Act in the early 80s, we not only do we excel in pharma innovation globally, but again, unlike in the European ecosystem, smaller biotech firms are a significant part of our ecosystem, especially at the early stages. I wonder if you could talk to that, and perhaps it might be helpful if you could bring a specific example to illustrate.
Perfect. Thank you, Jonathan. As we look at so many of the technologies that are too early stage and insufficiently de-risked for major corporate investments, very often it is the scientists, the researchers, the clinicians who are engaged early on, who see the potential, and who are willing to sacrifice through the formation of a startup company, and in particular to take that first series of steps through company formation under license from the university or the research institute that holds those intellectual property rights, again, enabled by the Bayh-Dole Act, and continues early stage investment then, sometimes supplemented by public sources of funding, the Small Business Innovation Research Program in the United States, SBIR, and its analogs in technology transfer have been important non-dilutive sources of capital to bring an early stage company a little bit farther along. In many cases too, there are seed stage funds that provide initial institutional capital and friends and family sources of funding as well to get a new business going. And so I'm really excited to have been involved in the very early stages of the biotech investment process through working with a company called Cetus. And Cetus, for many of you may know, that is the inventor of PCR. That's really used in so many diagnostics and other types of analyses and processing technologies, and also the having been involved at the very start of a company called Genentech that took a license from Stanford and others to the Cohen-Boyer patents for genetic engineering, and really were early players, and so these companies took licenses, took the early stage risk, and then ultimately either went onto the public markets, as in the case of Genentech, and in the case of Cetus, a downstream series of acquisitions to take that technology and that company to scale. So I think that from those very early days of the biotech industry, we've seen so many companies that have started off from a few researchers and clinicians who are really committed to seeing the early stage discoveries that they were involved in to go forward toward the clinic, but in the absence of major corporate sponsorship in those early days, just simply because of the risk.
Great. At this point, and let me just add there, what you see in all those companies that Walter mentioned, and if you go back all the way to perhaps maybe still the most famous biopharma patent of all time, the Cohen-Boyer patent, something unique arose in the US ecosystem, which is this figure of the scientist entrepreneur. And it all arises out of an interaction between the IP rights being supplied by the USPTO, but that's your catalyst, and the market responded to that in different forms of capital investment, not just at the back end, if we want to call it that, through large pharmaceutical partnerships on distribution and production, but the growth of a biopharma VC industry, right? That's critical because that enables this diversification of the tremendous risk that Walter pointed out at the beginning of his remarks. I want to invite any of our co-panelists if they'd like to weigh in here. And I know David Kappos is sitting right there in the middle of the financial capital of the world. And I'm sure he has something interesting to say about the role of IP rights in the business of biopharma. David, go right ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. And you can see the New York City skyline is right behind me here. That is the real New York City skyline. And I'm reminded, as probably the least academic of this group, that strongly agreeing, well, with everything you've said, which of course is spot on, and Jonathan also, but the other funding industry, private equity, the PE industry, Jonathan, you mentioned, the VCs, which are super important. The PE industry, I think it's fair to say, is centered here in New York City. And they take, a similarly bottom line business-like view of the role of any incentive in funding any investment. And in the case of biotech, I'll just briefly retell the story some people may have heard before about a meeting I had in one of these skyscrapers behind me here in New York City with principals of a private equity company that sits on literally hundreds of billions of dollars of investment capital. And their whole job is to figure out, as Jonathan explained, how to make good investments. And these people are not lawyers. They don't care less about any of the niceties we're talking about here with patent protection and, biopharma, all of that, those connective points. But as was explained to me by one of these principals when he took me aside, he said, look, Sonny, my job every day when I come into the office is at the end of the day, I need to have more money for my investors than I had at the beginning of the day. It's that simple. And if you smart people, you intellectual property lawyers, can provide me with a mechanism through your patent system to achieve those returns for my investors, I love you. But if you can't, I'm going to invest in pork bellies. Kid you not, that's the narrative, and that's the way people think. So for anyone who doesn't really get or fully understand the comments that Jonathan and Walt have made, if there's not a strong incentive system, in this case, a strong and effective patent system to protect the enormous amount of time and energy, cost, and failure involved in biopharma research, it just won't get funded, and it just won't happen.
Thank you so much, David. I think you summed up our main arguments here in what's called a New York Minute. So thank you. That was a great illustration. And I think what David and Walter are talking about is how the biopharma ecosystem, it's top down and bottom up at the same time. It's top down on the basic research, but it works because it's bottom up on pretty much everything else. And bottom up means you need to maintain a profit incentive for the capital investors to put capital into that industry. And we want our investors to put capital in the industry. That's what funds the exceptional costs. That's what makes innovation work. And that is what speeds time to market, ultimately benefiting the ecosystem as a whole. So thanks so much, Walter. I'm going to move on to Professor Erika Lytzan. Erika brings I think, a somewhat unique perspective to the world of academia insofar as she has amazingly deep practice experience. And I just want to point that out because one of the things that we're trying to bring to the table with this initiative is better integration of academic research with practice level knowledge. The legal details matter, the economic analysis matters, and we want to bring the ivory tower a little bit closer to what's happening in the real world, and we think that'll produce better results. So without further delay, Erika, why don't you go ahead? You're going to speak about how legal exclusivities, and I use that jargon somewhat unavoidably, support biopharma development. Thanks so much.
Thanks, and I'm happy to be here. Let me apologize. I moved back a second ago, and I may have to do it again. I have one of those lights with a light sensor, and it goes dark on me. So if I start moving and waving my hand suddenly, that's why. So the risk and the cost and the time that are involved in overcoming the regulatory barrier for biopharmaceutical products, which we've already been talking about a little bit, are the backdrop for these legal exclusivities that you were mentioning. And what's unique in the biopharmaceutical sector is kind of the range of these exclusivities that are available. There are, of course, centrally patents, and these can be patents on the compound, but there are a whole range of other possible patents that could protect a pharmaceutical innovation. But there are also a variety of exclusivities that apply at FDA that are part of the statutory and regulatory framework that are applied by FDA. And those are unique to the biopharmaceutical landscape. So, I mean, we can talk more about the patents themselves and how they, the patent experience plays out differently for pharmaceuticals. We could talk about the individual exclusivities. What I might do is just give you or give the audience a preview of the types of exclusivities that are available, because there are so many different ones and they are very unique to this space. There are, I would say, I think of it as sort of two types. There are some, again, this is still FDA, that are based in some sense on the innovator's patent portfolio. These are for small molecule drugs, and generally they work by preventing FDA from approving abbreviated applications from generic companies for products that would infringe. But then there are a whole suite of exclusivities that aren't related to the patent portfolio at all. The main thing, the one that I think people may be most familiar with, I would call data exclusivity. Rather than performing all of the research that Walter was talking about, the research the innovators perform, generic companies and biosimilar companies submit these abbreviated applications that rely on all of the research that the innovator performs. Data exclusivity is the period of time before they can do so. And as a practical matter, if a small molecule drug is a new, and I'm going to use a lot of jargon here, new active ingredient, it's a brand new molecule, the innovator is going to get at least 4 years before any abbreviated application can be filed. And this is a period of time that's guaranteed for the innovator. The same thing is true with a biosimilar. For a biological innovator, there's 4 years before a biosimilar application can even be submitted. And then there are rules about when they can be approved as well. And what's unique about this is, unlike the exclusive rights that are guaranteed with a patent, this kind of exclusivity doesn't have to be enforced in litigation. It operates on FDA because it prohibits the agency from accepting applications from a competitor or approving those applications. It applies automatically. So in a sense, it is rock solid. It's guaranteed. You could think of it almost like a period of quiet title, if you will. And it provides a kind of assurance that in some sense is stronger than the patent. There are a bunch of other exclusivities as well. There are some tailored to different kinds of innovation that policymakers want to encourage, that they were, I think, understandably concerned we didn't have enough incentives to encourage. So there's sort of a whole suite of things that are available here. And at the end of the day, these work, both the patent itself, the patent-based exclusivity that FDA administers, and then all of these other data exclusivities and other regulatory exclusivities, they work because, first of all, they provide an assurance, in some cases a really solid guarantee that the innovator is going to have a period of time after they do that 10 to 15 years of research, a period of time when they can market with some degree of exclusivity in the market and price their product advantageously in order to recoup some of that enormous investment that we have chosen to require for these products before they can be marketed. And I'll stop there so that I'm sure you have questions and we can go back and forth, but I'll stop there and we can talk about whatever makes sense to you.
Sure. Thanks. Thanks so much. That was a great big picture overview of something that has an area that has a lot of weeds in it. One of the things we're trying to do in the EIRA initiative is in biopharma to delve more deeply than some of the scholarship has in the interaction between the whole universe of exclusivities rather than focusing only on patents. And just to complete the picture, with at the risk of overcomplicating it, but it's essential part, and an essential part of the U.S. Regulatory approach. Again, we differ here from some other countries, especially Europe. Is we have all these protections, all of these carrots, if you will, for the pharmaceutical innovator, right? And all of these protections, let's make it really 40,000-foot view, right? If we merge this with Walter's comments, these are only kicking in, right, for that 10 to 12% that succeed in testing, right? That our pharmaceutical innovator has to recover costs not just on the products that reach market, but the much larger pool of products that do not reach market in order, again, to stay in business, and going back to David's New York Minute, to make it rational for investors to put money into this market. But on top of all that, I think, Erika, if you could speak a little bit about this unique element that I'm getting at, is the significant role that generics play in the biopharma market in the U.S. and our regulatory approach, right? Because we have Badol enacted in the 80s, but we also have Hatch-Waxman, right? And so we have this additional constraint essentially on the period during which an innovator enjoys economically meaningful exclusivity. Could you speak about that a little bit?
Yeah. So I think that the biopharmaceutical industry is really unique among the innovation sectors because we have chosen, as a matter of federal law, to require a substantial amount of research before the inventor can start commercializing their product, right? There is a mandatory process of performing also multiple phases of trials to show safety and efficacy in order to be able to simply commercialize the invention in the first instance. And although you didn't ask this, that has profound implications for the patent term, right? Much of the initial compound patent is chewed up during that time period, but that's not what you asked about. But here we are, they've done all of that research. I'm thinking about the report, which is excellent, talks about imitation risk as being one of the factors that investors think about. And what I would say is the risk of the prospect of imitations, or the risk of imitations here, is exacerbated by the fact that we give imitators, I don't want to call it a free pass at regulatory approval, but because it's not, but we give them a much, much reduced burden. So at a certain point, after that data exclusivity period ends, they show equivalence. If it's a small molecule drug, they're going to show that it's the same product, all right? And they compare their product with the brand product, but they don't have to do all of that research. And so they get this sort of reduced burden. It's a shorter time period to do the research. It's a much, much, much cheaper application. So then they can come to the market with their copy. And one of the interesting things that we do that's not mentioned in the report, but I think is worth thinking about, is we let them do that even if they don't do a perfect copy. So if they do a design around in some sense, they can still rely on the data. And so that is really unique here, that we impose this incredible burden on the innovator, and then we completely lift it for the competitors who copy. And I'm just going to add one additional nuance here, which can help, I think, help us understand why so many prescriptions in this country are for generic drugs, which is that we then require, as a function of state law, sometimes it's permissive, but a lot of times it's required, that the generic drug be actually the one dispensed when the script is written for the brand product. So, you know, it's a very, very unique, innovating environment. I think, you know, uniquely dangerous with all these subsequent risks that I think people thinking about where they're going to spend their money are going to be thinking about.
Yeah, thanks so much. As I think our audience might be gathering correctly, it's a complex balance. It's a complex balance at the federal level. Erika just brought up. It's a complex balance vertically to some extent between federal and state. Unlike other innovation sectors, if you think beyond the patent system, you include these exclusivity protections understood more broadly. You include the efforts made to facilitate generic entry with laudable objectives. It's critical to get the balance right. That's one of the things we will be emphasizing, exploring further in this project. As you pull one lever in the system, you need to anticipate what the effects are elsewhere. And the entire system is motivated. I think everyone shares a common objective. It's to try and get at that sweet spot. We talk about this in everywhere in IP policy. Incentives versus access, right? We want to facilitate access to existing innovations, but we don't want to suppress the incentives, especially of the private market, that is necessary to invest in future innovations to keep that flow of innovations going. And one of the things we'll be exploring in the initiative is using fact-based evidence, not intuition and not rhetoric, to drill down on exactly what works and what doesn't work. Erika, thank you very much. To stay on time, I'm going to move to our next panelist, Professor Kristina Acri. And Kristina, we'll be talking about patent myths in biopharma IP policy, and myths is understood broadly to mean generally accepted assumptions that may not have as sound an empirical basis as is commonly assumed. Myth sounds a lot more exciting, but that's the underlying the underlying idea. And one of the purposes of the initiative is to never take any assumption for granted. So even the most commonly accepted assumptions that are undergirding policy actions, sometimes of significant magnitude at the federal or state level, we want to subject that to empirical scrutiny and see if that actually stands up. And Kristina, I know that both in your single-authored work and with co-authors, including Erika and our panel, you've done exactly this type of work of testing assumptions against data and seeing if they hold up. Maybe the world's a little bit more complicated. Could you talk about some of your work in that area?
Absolutely. As Erika described, this is a very complex industry, and the regulations that frame it are very complex. So it's not surprising that there is a lot of misunderstanding that exists in this context. And the functions of patents in the biopharmaceutical industry are frequently misunderstood. There is a tendency to focus exclusively on the costs of patents, and as you put it, the short-run access to the new medicines at lower prices. And there's a perception that they are solely exclusionary mechanisms meant to block competition and preserve the exorbitant profits of the industry. Within the industry, the failure to understand the incentive dilemma gives rise to myths that patents are unnecessary, or even worse, that they are damaging to public health objectives. Biotechnology markets and others that rely almost exclusively on technological innovation are characterized by this incentive dilemma. That is, that these discoveries are easily imitated and that this replication can be done at significantly lower cost. As Erika described with the exclusivities that are out there, the game is in essence set up so that generic firms face lower costs. They face significantly less risk since these are products that have already been developed and proven to work. And they're guaranteed a market. Since prescribing is rigged towards them in the end, there's a market that exists for them. Given this, these discoveries are imitated easily, replicated at lower cost, and this happens both in terms of time and money, and the imitator can therefore underprice the innovator, and the incentive for innovation completely disappears at this point. Patents are the solution to this problem. They enable us to secure an intellectual property right that enables the innovator to essentially take legal action against unauthorized use. And though this is structured in a way to protect innovation, the industry itself is characterized as abusing the system. And the accusations that they face include placing profits over people. So a call that is frequently made to drive down pharmaceutical prices. Capitalizing unfairly on public research, such that consumers pay twice. They are both bearing the cost of funding public research, and then they turn around and have to pay high prices for the drugs that they, in essence, developed. The industry is also accused of unfairly securing multiple patents on a single drug or medicine, something that is pejoratively known as evergreening, and also is building an impenetrable thicket of patents, so that in essence, by getting patent after patent, they're able to prevent generic entry and preserve these profits for a lengthy period of time. The myths that are out there focus only on the exclusionary function of patents and their impact on prices in the short run, instead of looking at the totality of their function, including their role in transactions and facilitating the formation of supply chains and reducing expropriation risks. We have this short-run look at one aspect and one aspect only. And this misplaced emphasis fails to recognize what we would be missing out on without patents. New medicines, new treatments, and cures would never be invented. We would cease to see the innovation that we've got these days, and those things would disappear without the patents that protect them and incentivize these investments. Understanding the subtleties is more difficult, indeed very, very difficult, but it does make clear that the role of patents in biopharmaceutical innovation is unmistakably important and critical to their very existence. I think that if we dig a little deeper and move beyond the myths, we see that they're not myths at all. It's just misunderstanding of the very complex ecosystem that protects innovation, incentivizes the investment that takes place, allows us to rely on both public and private investment in dividing up the labor that in essence goes into the development of a drug, as well as its commercialization. And it's through all of that and the beauty of patents that we end up with the treatments and medicines that give us longer lives and healthier lives.
Thank you so much. That was incredibly well said. Just a logistical point. There's some questions coming through from the audience, which is great, that are focused on thoughts on policy trajectory as we move from one administration to the other at the federal level. I just wanted to let those questioners know that David Kappos will be speaking roughly in that area at the end, right at the end of our panel. So we just ask for your patience, and David will be offering some thoughts on that on that point. So Kristina, you bring up some great points here. Sort of we talk about in the area I used to work in about a short-term bias in the capital markets. And it looks like in the biopharma policy area, both on the policymaking side, but also to some extent perhaps on the scholarly side, as well, a focus on the short-term costs, perhaps because it's quite easily measurable, right? You can very clearly see it in the pricing movement when generics come in, and so that's a data point that people can focus on. And part of our reason that we're embarking on this initiative is to bring to the table and to encourage researchers to develop the tools to try and measure long-term benefits. Those are harder to see, right? Long-term benefits in terms of innovation, and then even harder to measure, and here qualitative tools might be a great complement, is that market making, that transaction enabling function of patents. And we do seem to see in the scholarly literature a divergence sometimes between assumptions and market performance, or market realities, I should say. And I'm going to ask you to speak a little bit more about your work on the so-called evergreening practice, but I'll just give you one of my own examples while you're thinking about that. It was once widely asserted in the scholarly literature, when this was a new development, that the extension of patent rights into biomedical research would cause what was called an anti-commons. And the idea is that it would stifle research and it would stifle development because it would interrupt the free flow of information, right? Now, just eyeballing this in terms of the explosion of the biotech market, it doesn't seem right. And more systematic empirical studies have found very little evidence of any anti-commons effect. And in fact, they tend to find the opposite, that in fact, it facilitates the transmission of knowledge from academia into industry. And so that's an example where a very widely shared assumption among a large portion of legal academia, even some portions of the economics community, just doesn't seem to describe the actual real world. On that note, I'd like you to share with us, if you can, briefly, I know the work that you've done individually and with Erika and other co-authors is incredibly detailed, but is there something similar going on with the evergreening slogan? Is there a similar divergence between rhetoric and reality?
Absolutely. And thank you for the question and the beautiful introduction, as well as the beautiful report that we're all discussing and building on. I think that to take two steps backwards and reflect on your comment about counting and looking at the numbers, in addition to looking at the numbers for how prices drop when generics enter, there's a focus on counting the number of patents that protect a drug. And this is part of the origin of the evergreening phenomenon, that critics look at this and say, oh, this is a drug that has multiple patents on it. And so obviously there's something nefarious going on here, that this is a single drug, so it should have a single patent that should protect it for a fixed amount of time, and then we should be done and see generic entry and competition. But what we see instead is that there are multiple patents here. And so obviously something is wrong and it's an abuse of the system. And what we miss when we don't look at the subtleties and don't dig in a bit is that a drug is not a single innovation. There's not just one discovery to be protected. There are multiple discoveries that are embodied in a single drug. And when we count the number of patents, we also make the mistake of failing to recognize rather, that there may be multiple drugs that are in play here. There may be different formulations. There may be a version that is suited to children. There may be versions that treat different diseases or disease conditions. And each of those had to undergo lots and lots of testing, lots and lots of innovation in order to make it to market. So to say that we should have only one patent and any additional patents is an abuse is very short-sighted. And without allowing these additional patents, we would have one formulation, and that's where innovation would end. We wouldn't see drugs that had multiple doses per day reduced to a single dose per day, per month, per 6-month period. And I think that those are innovations that are of value to patients and also increase adherence, and make them easier and more widely accepted in terms of dosing and taking those things. And digging into what the numbers are actually reflecting instead of simply performing a count allows us to see that the numbers indicate not an abuse of the system, but a flourishing of thought and idea and research that makes our lives richer.
Thank you so much. And just to round out the session, I am going to turn to your co-author on some of this great work that you've been doing, and I have to say, I believe underappreciated work in the scholarly community and policy community. So Erika, you have worked on some of these papers with Kristina. You bring that practice experience as well, which is critical. I wanted to just give you a chance to add something on, let's call it the product extension debate in biopharma, divergence between prevailing wisdom, let's say in academia, and facts on the ground.
Thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, so I think that the essence of the evergreening accusation is that there is, as you say, some kind of extension of the monopoly on the product. And I think one of the things that's missed, as Kristina said, there are lots of different patents covering different inventions, and there are lots of different products. And the thing that is missed is that all of these have a fixed ending period. They expire when they expire. And so if an inventor has product, we'll call it version 1.0, the patent or patents and the exclusivities expire when they expire, and there can be generic entry at that point, copies of that product. The brand company, there may be other inventions and other products under protection, but there can be generic entry copies of that initial product. And so one of the things that Kristina and I did, one of the big papers that we did, looked at a major database that had counted the patents and the expiry dates for a bunch of new drugs, and had said, well, the last expiring exclusivity is way out here, so that's when you might expect generic entry. And we did several hundred tests for products where we knew the generic entry date. And on average, it was, I just pulled it up while she was talking, within our data set, there was generic competition launching an average of 84 months before that widely lauded database claimed it would. So the notion that there is extension, I mean, first of all, it's sort of theoretically wrong because it misses the fact that these are different products, but also it's empirically not the case.
Thanks so much. And in the really compressed time that I gave you, Erika and Kristina, I think you gave our audience a sense of what we're trying to achieve here. We're trying to drill down on the data to test these assumptions without any foregone conclusions. See where the numbers take us. Kristina and Erika, I can't recommend this work to our audience highly enough. And we plan to invest more in this type of work. When you drill down in the data, the world is often a lot more complex, and assumptions need to be qualified, and in some cases they need to be rebutted. And something that Erika and Kristina's work has shown is that in many circumstances, and it may be in most, what is called product extension or evergreening is just a simple case, familiar in economics, of product differentiation, and that's generally a good thing for competition, not a bad thing. Okay, so we have a half hour left, and I will now turn to Judge Michel, and we're going to be talking about a topic that I know Judge Michel has written on. I know it's close to his heart, and that is the place of the Bayh-Dole Act in the U.S. biopharma ecosystem. We'll start off with his opening remarks, and we'll we'll take it from there. And I'll just point out to our audience, those who are not aware, this is an act that has received a great deal of critique in policy circles, some academic circles over the past few years. And so it'll be interesting to see what Judge Michel's view is on that. And of course, as former Chief Judge of the Federal Circuit, he was right in the midst of seeing how this act plays out. Judge Michel?
Thank you, Jonathan. Let me begin by observing that in the push for greater attention to facts and tight analysis so that reality is properly described and policy isn't made based on myths, misunderstandings, or maybe even intentional misunderstandings in some cases, it's worth pointing out that this initiative is desperately needed. I spend a lot of time in recent years dealing with policymakers and their staffs, mostly in Washington, and informing them and making sure that their mental picture of what's going on in the real world is accurate is a very daunting task. There's an enormous amount of misinformation, disinformation, erroneous assumption, and the rest, as earlier speakers have mentioned. So the need for this initiative is enormous because the policymakers are blinded by confusion and lack of understanding. Let me next comment briefly on the composition of this panel, because it also shows a desperate need. And that is IP policy can't only be made by IP lawyers from the narrow legal perspective. And this panel, to me, is a wonderful microcosm of different disciplines, all contributing a perspective on what is happening out there in the real world. So Professor Barnett, of course, is an economist by training and an IP lawyer and an academic professor. As was mentioned earlier, Erika Lytzan, a longtime practitioner, obviously an expert in food and drug administration law and practice, and now doing academic work of great importance. Kristina Acri, again, is a serious economist, not a patent lawyer. I think not a lawyer at all, which I consider wonderful and very beneficial. The quip people make of, oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't comment on this because I'm not a lawyer. I always want to say, no, all the more should you comment on this. It's helpful to have other perspectives brought to bear on some of these same problems. Of course, Dr. Kopan is at an academic institution, was previously the head of the National Institute of Standards, was very much involved in policy during the original Trump administration in very important roles. David Kappos, a longtime executive at IBM for decades, who's prosecuted patents and done everything else at every stage of the patenting process, and of course was the head of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office recently. So this panel is like the dream team in sports terminology because it represents such different but complementary disciplines and the separate perspectives that that can be brought to bear. One of the wisest people I ever knew used very simple imagery. He said, learning wisdom in order to build sound policy, you have to think of it as being like a jigsaw puzzle. There are many pieces. They have to be fit together properly. Each discipline or each person may have one piece, but they don't have all the other pieces. And so getting them to work together, talk together, analyze together, integrate their insights, put those pieces together, you're going to get the puzzle assembled, and then you're going to have a much better chance of policy. Now, just a quick word about history. In 1980, the Bayh-Dole Act was passed. And let me just move forward quickly. In 1980, also, the Supreme Court made a very important decision, which is well covered in this paper that's being recommended to our listeners and others, and it's very valuable. I've read it several times. It's a gold mine of important facts and very apt analysis. And as far as I can tell, it is absolutely without any bias or favoritism or spin at all. It is a purely analytical, logical, fact-based paper. So the Supreme Court basically okayed the biotech industry in the Chakrabarty case in 1980, just like the year of passage of Bayh-Dole. In the next year, the Supreme Court also did something very important in the area of patent eligibility in the Diamond versus Deere case. And frankly, some of the cases that came along later in the teens and created chaos, created what Director Kappos aptly calls a mess out of eligibility law, um, ignored the Diamond Deere holding and analysis and went off in a totally different direction on based on assumptions. 1982, the Federal Circuit was created in the Federal Courts Improvement Act. 1984, as was mentioned, the Hatch-Waxman Act passed. So you have 4 or 5 huge fundamental restructurings of the economic incentives and the legal mechanisms. And I think a brilliant and history proved it to be a very effective set of initiatives. And then we have 40 years with the partial exception, that's my spin on it, of the American Invents Act. There hasn't been any major initiative that's comparable to Bayh-Dole or Hatch-Waxman or the 2 Supreme Court cases that I mentioned, or even the creation of the Federal Circuit. And with respect to the Federal Circuit, we often focus on policy being made by the Congress, which of course it is, and properly so in a democratic country. But policy is also made by the FDA, as Erika stressed. Policy is obviously made by the Patent Office, at least at the margins and often beyond that. But policy can also be made, for better or worse, by the courts. And so whether the courts are well informed about economics, about business realities, about empirical analysis is just as important as whether the Congress is well informed. So now on Bayh-Dole. It came about in such a wonderful way. As I understand the genesis, leaders at Purdue University went to Indiana Senator Birch Bayh and said, we have a terrible problem. We have all this federally funded research in our great research universities, and we've had it for a long time, but almost none of it is resulting in products that get into the hands of consumers. And of course, in the case of drugs and health treatments, vitally important for all the obvious reasons, many of which have been mentioned. And the reason is because nobody in private industry, small, middle, or large size entity that's in the for-profit world can afford to get engaged without some reasonable level of exclusivity. And under the pre-Bayh-Dole regime, exclusive licenses were essentially unavailable. Not surprisingly, something like less than 5% of all the federally funded inventions ever got into commercialization, as we call it, or translation into real products, pass all the tests at FDA and get into the pharmacy to benefit patients and their families and the whole society. So the Bayh-Dole regime, I'll call it, upended that and made exclusive licensing permissible. And it worked a revolution. It's been an astonishing success. And the intention of the law was to incentivize exclusivity and the massive investments it would be expected to bring and did bring. And it was stated clearly after the passage of the act by the 2 named senators, Bayh and Dole. Of course, Robert Dole, senator from Kansas, partnered with Senator Birch Bayh to lead the way to the passage of the Bayh-Dole Act. And that's why it's named as it is. But it's just astonishing what a success has been. And I find it very ironic that it's under such sustained attack from many angles by many different self-interested groups. Therefore, the effort of these fellow panel members and of this new initiative that Bo Heiden and Professor Barnett have created, have invented, is so very important. And I should also have mentioned, in terms of different disciplines, my friend Bo Heiden, not a lawyer, he's an engineer by training. He's a policy expert, but from an engineering perspective. So again, a whole new different discipline brought to bear on these things. So I find it quite astonishing that the Bayh-Dole Act is under such attack, particularly when it's based mostly on narratives that are highly inaccurate, incomplete, misleading, and so forth. I got so concerned about this that when I was invited out of the blue by the University of Virginia, where I went to law school, to become a part of their tech transfer office by being on their board of directors, I accepted because I wanted to learn more at the nuts and bolts level of how this really worked. So for the last 2 years or so, I've been one of the directors on the board of the tech transfer operation at the University of Virginia, and it has really been an eye-opener. One thing it's shown me is the extreme sensitivity to what happens in the courtroom and what happens in the boardroom of the whole system, and how that impacts the ability of a university to license, successfully license, productively license inventions financed at least in part by federal money. And of course, it's not only research universities, as has been mentioned, it's also engineering firms, private hospitals, clinics, and many other nonprofit actors who tend to do the basic science research that then needs to be translated. So we have a legal regime that's been proven. We don't need to guess what would happen if we trash the Bayh-Dole regime. We know what happened. It's everything that happened before 1980. It would happen all over again. It's absolutely clear, in my opinion. So the idea that Bayh-Dole should be weakened or abrogated just makes no sense to me. But the only way to combat it effectively at an intellectual level, there are other things like campaign contributions and lobby campaigns and PR campaigns that also have some impact on the Congress. But at an intellectual level, this initiative is so critical because there's no other way to get past the myth, to get the reality in the brains of the policymakers and their advisors instead of the myths that are false and assumptions. So I'm so happy to be part of this panel, and I can't thank Bo and Jonathan enough for launching this terribly important effort, and for the others on the panel for participating not only today, but in all the work that they do every day. And the last point I want to make is, in the end, it's all about money. In innovation, modern innovation, especially in the health arena, is extremely expensive, not only risky and slow, but extremely expensive. The federal government is basically out of money. There's no way, with our national debt growing precipitously every year, with the annual budget deficits, there's no way that the federal government can produce the money to fund all of what the private sector is now funding. They just can't do it. And they couldn't do it as well as the private sector in any event, in my opinion. But it's just impossible. They don't have the money. They're already, in a sense, out of money. So it's all a question of private sector money. There's ample money. David gave some figures of the private equity industry. And of course, then there are venture capitalists, then there are the corporations, large and small, and all of their investors. So basically, if you strengthen the incentives, you get more investment. You get more investment, you get more research. You get more translation of research into critically important new cures. Final point is, I'm not a doctor. People like to say, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a doctor, but I'm reliably informed by medical experts that we live in a time of huge challenge about human health. The majority of known diseases and adverse conditions have no cure, the majority of them. And the ability to effectively mediate adverse health consequences of diseases and bad conditions depends heavily on early and accurate diagnosis. And so the whole diagnostic part of the health industry has a particularly critical role. And when eligibility concerns and other reasons hamper the investment there, we're going to get less diagnostic breakthroughs, and it's going to hurt patients just the way not having new drugs is going to hurt future patients, not just in the long term. We talk about the long term, but the long term is also next year and the year after that and 5 years after that and a decade after that. It's not way off in the future. It's coming quickly. So it's all about money flows when you boil it down to bare essentials. And that's why economists like Professor Barnett and Professor Acri are so very, very important. And people in the university area like Erika and Walt are so important. And people who advise companies on where they're going to deploy their money, and investment firms and where they're going to deploy their money are going to save the future of the human race if they're not torpedoed by ill-advised activists. End of story.
Thanks so much. That was a very comprehensive overview of the act and the effects it had and the problems that it was designed to remedy. And I'll keep my response brief so that we have time for our final panelist, David Kappos, and talk more about policy and DC focused stuff and steps going forward. But just two things I'll highlight from Judge Michel's remarks. Judge Michel started off talking about how we have a variety of professional backgrounds represented here, and that is exactly one of the things we're trying to do in the initiative. We want to move outside of the IP specific silo. We want to bring in insights from people in medical science, from people in finance, and from legal practitioners. So if anyone in our audience would like to contribute, we welcome your input and we welcome your offers to contribute. We think that will give a more practically minded insight into getting that incentive access balance right in the biopharma ecosystem. And just the second thing I wanted to add is Judge Michel started off with this great anecdote about Purdue University, which I wasn't aware of. And I just wanted to point out for our audience, that's a great anecdote, but it's only the tip of the iceberg that I discovered in my own research. The enactment of the act in the early 80s followed decades worth of agency reports, commission reports that repeated the same refrain. We're offering all of this technology for free to the private sector, and no one seems to want it. Well, that's not really a paradox, because if you can't get exclusivity either through an assignment or an exclusive license, there's just no way that capital will rationally allocate to a project that today has development costs in the hundreds of millions, by some estimates, in the billions of dollars in some cases, with that very low success rate that Walter pointed out. And this is, facts are important, empirical facts are important, history is important as well. And I think that's an especially glaring omission in the current critique of this statute, is that the history leading up to the statute has almost entirely been overlooked or forgotten. So in our time remaining, David Kappos has been waiting patiently. David, we have a question coming in from our audience, which I think leads right into your remarks, and the question reflects a view that under the outgoing administration, that policy actions or policy proposals have been undertaken that tends to limit these exclusivity protections, either in strength or time, and hurting investment incentives. What is your view? And I think this is manifested perhaps most clearly in segueing from Judge Michel's remarks in the effort to expand the way margin rights can be used under the Bayh-Dole Act. But what is your view as we move from one administration into the other? How can biopharmaceutical policy, innovation policy be influenced in a way that can attract capital into this industry and ultimately benefit consumers?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Great place to start. Let's just go at that question straight on. So,
All right.
look, the good news here is we've got not one or two, but actually three pieces of pending legislation that will be very, very helpful to restoring an agenda of pursuing strong and effective intellectual property rights for the biopharma industry. The first one is the Restore Act, which is all about injunctive rights, which is super important in this industry. The second one is the Prevail Act, which is about fixing the Patent Trial and Appeal Board, which is more or less secondary to biopharma industry, but not completely beyond the point. And the third one is PARA, Patent Eligibility Restoration Act, which has a very significant impact in the diagnostics area, in the genetics related area on the biopharma industry. So I would tell you that the way to get things turned around quickly for the biopharma industry in this domain that we're in today is for the new administration. This is the Secretary of Commerce, the new head of the Patent and Trademark Office, and others, including the new head of NIST and others in the administration who have a role in the intellectual property area, to rally behind these three bills, which surely can be reintroduced in Congress. Rally behind these bills, stop either silently opposing them or not being involved, and get involved and help move them forward into enacted legislation. So that would be my first part. How does that happen? It happens when the biopharma industry goes in, Jonathan, to the new administration, as well as key champions in Congress, and makes a point that has not yet been discussed straight on this webinar, but you made in your paper that is, to me, fundamentally important. I think Erika might have mentioned it. We need to not only think about the cost of patents, we need to think more about the cost of not having patents, right? What is that cost? It's foregone cures. It's people dying and suffering from diseases. It's lost productivity, right? It's all the jobs and innovation that goes with the biopharma industry. It's higher cost of healthcare because new cures aren't available and we're providing palliative or symptomatic treatments instead of curing diseases. We need to focus on that, and your paper does a great job of putting a point on it. And we need the biopharma industries and others to be in there going hard at the beginning of the administration, both at the administration itself and at Congress, and talking about the cost of not having patents and putting a point on that. So that would be, Jonathan, my as succinct as I can be in answering the direct question. If I can, there was one other point that I thought came up in a previous question, which is, well, what should we expect from the new administration? Well, of course, nobody knows for sure. There's a lot of speculation going on right now. I think I'm repeating what many have said to say, look, it's difficult to predict, very difficult to predict. But a couple of things that look possibly promising. Number one, the designate for Secretary of Commerce is a person who knows a lot about the IP system, who's got a lot of patents and has benefited tremendously from the patent system. So we're going to actually have someone running commerce who gets this area. That could be very helpful. The other thing that I would point to is a desire to make some significant changes. Well, sometimes that's not good, sometimes it is good. In this case, moving away from the policies of the previous administration, could be a good thing for the biopharma industry. The one other thing that could be good, hard to say, I'm reminded of, a call I was on just earlier this morning with someone who's very close to the new administration. Don't underestimate the level of aggressiveness that's going to be on display and is going to be acted on. And that could be a good thing too. If it starts from the premise that a strong and effective IP system will cause money to flood into biopharma research, development, and product creation, and all the benefits that come out of that.
Great. Thanks so much, David, for those remarks. Unless Carla tells me otherwise, I'm going to go to minute 32, which I think we started about 2 minutes past the hours, just so we have enough time for this last segment. And David, I totally agree with you. Part of the big picture objective here is to get balance in that debate. And Kristina mentioned this. What's the cost of not having patents? And everything we know about innovation economics in biopharma and elsewhere tells us that's going to be the bigger number. Again, recognizing the unique element in biopharma of that human cost of limitations on access in the short term, and that's a key theme of the initiative, and that's why we want balance on incentives to access, not just one or the other. But a specific question I wanted to ask you to address, David, and I believe it is fair to say that you are uniquely positioned to answer this. If you go back to that original policy cocktail that kind of set off biotech and a lot of other good things in the U.S. innovation ecosystem, you've got the Chakrabarty decision, Supreme Court, you've got the Bayh-Dole Act, you've got the establishment of the Federal Circuit. But also, if you go back to that Cohen-Boyer patent, you had leadership being exercised by USPTO. It was controversial at the time. The Europeans didn't do it. They resisted it to extend patents into this area. What is something specific or what kind of leadership can the USPTO, can an incoming USPTO director deliver to preserve and to strengthen U.S. leadership in the biopharma industry?
Yeah, great question, Jonathan. First thing I would say is to get the administration behind those three pieces of legislation that I mentioned before. And if the USPTO director is invested and passionate about supporting those, particularly with a strong Secretary of Commerce who knows the patent system, anything is achievable. So that would be my first item. Item number two, the U.S. needs to retake leadership in areas like the TRIPS waivers, the 2 TRIPS waivers that were frankly disastrous. And in any previous era of the U.S., we would have been the first putting our hand up to say, no, we're not doing this, not going to do it, right? Waiving intellectual property rights for some, mythical issue, right, is not good, and we're not going to do it. We failed at leadership. In fact, we signed on to a non-fact-based, fiction-based agenda with both of those waivers, shamefully so, I would say. We need to not only stop that, but we need to reverse it. The new PTO leadership should be helping Congress craft and support legislation that categorically rejects the notion of waivers of patent rights in the biopharma industry for, really basically any purpose. So I would point to that as a key area where the USPTO can begin exercising leadership. And then I'll give you one more, Jonathan. We've got this craziness now going on with bills requiring the USPTO and the FDA to work together. And you hear that, and the first thing he says, well, why shouldn't they work together? They're 2 federal agencies. Well, let me tell you something. They already do work together. They work together plenty, right? And what the current legislative proposals are forcing is 3 words that are dreaded in the federal government: waste, fraud, and abuse, right? Because they're forcing agencies to spin their wheels together like little hamsters in a hamster wheel, wasting time and resources when on issues where the agencies do not need to coordinate and have no business coordinating. So what should the new director of the PTO do? Together with the new leader of the FDA and others in the administration, and get Congress to do, is reject the notion of wasteful overlap and wheel spinning between the USPTO and the FDA. Declare what does work and what's already being done between those two agencies, and get help from Congress to pass legislation that ensures that those agencies get to do their own jobs and not waste their time and resources overlapping their missions and their efforts. And I could go on, but that's just that's just.
I know you could. And thank you so much. Those are some very concrete action items, and some of those touch on themes that we know the incoming administration is emphasizing, especially efficiency. We're going to have to end it there. I apologize to some of our online commenters that we weren't able to address all of your remarks, but we endeavored to address some of them. I would like to thank each of our distinguished panelists for your valuable time today in making this a successful launch. We look forward to working with each of you in developing and evolving this this project. And again, we encourage those who are viewing the launch today or will in the future view it through a recording. We welcome contributions, not just from lawyers, not just from economists, from scientists, policymakers, and the business world as well, to bring an informed basis to biotech policy in this country. Thank you very much.